Before we dive into this gripping tale from the wild frontier, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell. We bring you true stories of courage, secrets, and redemption from the Old West every week. Now, picture this. A black rancher, known only as Elias, lived in the dusty outskirts of a frontier town, far from the prying eyes of society. He was a man of few words, hardened by the land and rumors that whispered of a dark past. His ranch stretched across sun-scorched hills and was his sanctuary from a world that never welcomed him. But that peace was shattered one evening when a woman in a tattered wedding dress collapsed at his doorstep, breathless and terrified. Her name was Clara, and she had just run away from her own wedding. And what she brought with her wasn't just fear, it was danger. Clara's lips trembled as she clutched the torn hem of her dress. Her hands were bleeding, her veil covered in dust. Elias offered her water and a seat by the fire without asking questions. That was his way. Let people talk when they were ready. As the night deepened and coyotes howled in the distance, Clara began to speak. She told him she was forced into marrying a wealthy rancher named Royce Calhoun, a man feared across counties for his temper and violent control over his estate. She said she couldn't go through with it, not after discovering what Royce had done to the last girl who said no. Elias listened silently, but inside, something stirred, an old fire that he thought he had buried long ago. Clara stayed the night, curled in a blanket on Elias' old leather couch, the flickering fire casting shadows across her bruised arms. The next morning, Elias saddled up his horse and rode into town under the guise of buying supplies. But in truth, he wanted to hear what the locals were saying. And sure enough, the town buzzed with gossip. Royce Calhoun's bride had vanished, and he was livid. He'd put out a bounty, dead or alive, on anyone hiding her. Elias returned home, his jaw tight and eyes scanning the horizon. Clara's presence had turned his ranch from a sanctuary into a target. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. The days passed in uneasy silence. Clara helped mend the fences, feed the horses, and even cooked. Elias noticed her strength, not just in her arms, but in her spirit. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. But at night, when the wind howled through the cracks of the old cabin, she'd flinch at every sound. Elias kept his rifle close and started sleeping near the front door. He knew Royce wouldn't wait forever. Men like him didn't let go. They hunted. And Clara had just given him a reason to come after Elias too. Yet, for reasons Elias couldn't explain, he didn't regret it. One evening, Clara asked Elias why he lived alone. He paused, then answered with a story of betrayal. Years ago, he'd saved a man's life during a cattle raid. That man later married Elias' sister, and killed her in a drunken rage. When Elias sought justice, the town sheriff, friends with the killer, did nothing. So Elias took the law into his own hands. Since then, people feared him, labeled him dangerous, even though he only ever defended what was right. Clara listened with wide eyes, and for the first time, she saw not just a rancher, but a man who had been hurt, deeply. That night, as Elias watched the fire crackle, he noticed something: boot prints near the back of the barn. Fresh ones. He didn't mention it to Clara but stayed up with his rifle, eyes sharp and breath steady. At dawn, he found a torn piece of paper nailed to a post. It read, "Return what's mine, or the fire comes next." It was Royce's handwriting. Elias was sure of it. He burned the note and looked at Clara with heavy eyes. The storm was coming, and it would test every ounce of resolve they had. Elias began preparing the ranch for war. He booby-trapped certain paths, moved the horses to a hidden canyon, and stored supplies in the root cellar. Clara watched, nervous but determined. She wanted to help, but Elias told her, "Your job is to survive." But Clara wasn't the type to sit idle. She learned to shoot with calm focus. She watched the land like a hawk. And then, one night, as the moon rose like a silent guardian, she spotted movement. 3 riders, creeping through the mesquite trees, heading straight toward the cabin. Elias fired the first warning shot. One rider fell. The others scattered. Clara ran to grab more ammunition while Elias took cover behind the porch. The standoff lasted until dawn. By morning, two of the intruders lay tied under the oak tree, bruised and silent. One of them confessed. Royce was coming himself. He'd bring 5 more men. "He wants to burn this place down," the man said, spitting blood. Elias looked to the rising sun and knew this land had seen blood before, but this time it might drown in it. The following days were a blur of preparation. Elias taught Clara how to hide in the ravine behind the barn if things got bad. She argued, but he insisted. "If I fall, someone has to live to tell it." That night, they shared a quiet dinner. The fear in their eyes was real, but so was something else, a bond forged through fire. Clara looked at him and said, "If I had met you first, I never would have run." Elias didn't reply. He just nodded, and for the first time in years, he allowed a sliver of hope into his guarded heart. At dawn, Royce arrived. 6 riders strong, all armed and cruel-eyed. Elias stood alone at the gate, rifle in hand. "You're trespassing," he called. Royce laughed from atop a black stallion. "You've got something that belongs to me." Elias replied, "No. She left. And she ain't yours." Royce spat and raised his hand. The first bullet ripped through Elias' shoulder, but he didn't fall. He fired back, hitting one of the men square in the chest. Then chaos erupted. Clara, despite everything, joined the fight, rifle steady. Her first shot knocked another rider off his horse. And just like that, the tide began to turn. As the sun dipped lower behind the jagged ridge, Ezra prepared supper from what little supplies he had, dried beans and salt pork. He offered the woman a seat by the fire and noticed her glancing toward the horizon, restless. When he asked her name, she hesitated before saying, "June." No last name. Her voice trembled like a creek at winter's end. Ezra didn't press her, sensing the weight of whatever she was running from. But the silence between them was heavy, stretching across the desert air. In that pause, the howling wind outside seemed to whisper warnings. As night fell completely, June jolted at every sound, each coyote call or creaking board setting her nerves on edge. Ezra knew that fear. He'd once lived with it, too. June barely touched her food. Ezra noticed how she clutched a small satchel to her chest as if it contained her soul. She finally broke her silence to ask, "You ever been hunted, mister?" Ezra's jaw tightened. Memories of blood, betrayal, and a past he'd buried came rushing back. "Yes," he said simply. Her eyes met his, full of unspoken pain. "He's coming. The man I left at the altar. And he don't forgive." Ezra didn't flinch. He asked, "He know you're here?" She shook her head. "Not yet." That "yet" hung in the air like a gun waiting to fire. Ezra stoked the fire higher, the flames mirroring the tension building between survival and confrontation. The next morning, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Ezra stood still, listening. He scanned the mesa's edge with narrowed eyes. Dust clouds trailed behind a fast rider, alone, for now. June's face went pale. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. Ezra nodded and calmly told her to get inside. He moved with deliberate precision, retrieving a worn rifle from beneath the floorboards. He hadn't fired it in years, but his hands remembered. June watched him, a strange mix of fear and hope flickering in her eyes. She hadn't expected protection. Not from a stranger. Not after the life she'd fled. But Ezra wasn't just any rancher. He was a man with history carved into his bones. The rider approached, dismounted with swagger, and pounded on the door. "Open up, Ezra. We got business." Ezra opened the door slowly, rifle in hand but not raised. The man was younger than Ezra, but his eyes burned with vengeance. "She here." the groom demanded. Ezra didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "What's your business with her?" The groom's hand twitched near his belt. "She belongs to me." Ezra stepped forward. "She's not property." The man sneered. "You really want to die for some runaway?" Ezra's voice was steady. "If it comes to that." Silence stretched between them until the groom spat on the porch and stormed off, this time. But Ezra knew he'd be back. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. The days that followed were quiet, but Ezra could feel the storm building. He showed June how to shoot, how to saddle a horse fast, how to stay hidden in the brush if needed. She picked it up quick, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. At night, they sat by the fire, and June slowly opened up about the life she'd fled. A man who smiled in public but beat her in secret, a wedding planned to silence shame, and a family that sold her off like cattle. Ezra listened, his heart heavy with old ghosts. He shared nothing in return, but June could see it in his eyes. He'd once loved and lost, too. Silence became their bond, unspoken but unbreakable. One evening, while checking the fence line, Ezra spotted something glinting in the dirt. Spurs. Fresh. He knelt down, touched the imprint, and knew the groom had been there. Watching. Waiting. Ezra hurried back to the cabin and told June to pack light. "Tonight, we don't sleep here." She didn't argue. As they rode through the darkness, every rustle in the brush made her flinch. They camped near a dried-up creek, horses tethered in a thicket. Ezra stayed awake all night, rifle resting across his lap. June tried to sleep but woke up screaming from a dream. Ezra soothed her without words, just a hand on her shoulder. She cried silently, the desert wind carrying her sobs into the stars. By morning, Ezra knew they couldn't keep running forever. "We stand or we disappear," he said. June nodded, determination replacing fear. They returned to the ranch with a plan. Ezra knew the land better than any man alive. He set traps near the ravine and placed warning shots in obvious sight. June helped without hesitation, dragging logs, stacking crates, anything to fortify their position. For the first time, she didn't feel helpless. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had purpose now. That night, she asked Ezra why he was risking everything for her. He looked at her for a long time. "Because no one stood up for my sister. She died running." June didn't speak, but her hand found his. At dawn, they heard them, 3 riders this time. Ezra positioned June in the loft, rifle aimed at the front path. He took his post on the porch. The groom led the pack, eyes scanning the horizon like a predator. Ezra called out, "You got one chance to leave." The groom laughed. "And you got one chance to hand her over." Ezra fired a warning shot that hit the dirt an inch from the groom's boot. The other riders hesitated. One muttered, "He's serious." The groom snarled but didn't advance. For minutes that felt like hours, tension coiled like a snake. Finally they retreated, but Ezra knew it wasn't over. This was just the first round. And the war had begun. That night, the wind screamed louder than usual. June couldn't sleep. Ezra paced outside, every sense alert. Around midnight, a torch flared in the distance, then another. They were coming back. And this time, they brought fire. June grabbed her rifle and joined Ezra outside. Together, they watched the glowing line approach the ranch like a crawling inferno. Ezra whispered, "If they burn this place, they won't stop there." June nodded. "Then we don't let him." They stood side by side as the flames drew closer. Ezra felt something shift inside him, not just the instinct to protect, but the urge to fight for something again. For someone. For a future that might be possible. The attackers charged. Gunshots echoed across the plain. June's aim was steady. She hit one rider in the shoulder, sending him tumbling. Ezra took out another's horse, forcing him to flee. The groom rode straight for Ezra, eyes wild, pistol drawn. They clashed in a whirlwind of hooves and dust. Ezra's rifle was knocked from his hands, and for a moment it seemed like the end. But June screamed his name, distracting the groom just long enough. Ezra tackled him, fist meeting jaw. The fight was brutal, both men fueled by rage. Finally, Ezra pinned him down, rifle pressed to his chest. "It's over," Ezra growled. The groom laughed bitterly. "She ain't worth it," Ezra replied. "You never were." The sheriff arrived 2 days later, alerted by townsfolk who saw the fire from miles away. Ezra told the whole story, and June backed it up. The groom was taken into custody, bruised and broken. The law, for once, sided with truth. Ezra watched them ride away with no sense of victory, just peace. June stood beside him, her hand wrapped around his. "Thank you," she said, and those 2 words carried more weight than any vow. Ezra nodded, but didn't smile. Not yet. The fire had taken part of the barn, but they would rebuild. Together. And though nothing was certain in the West, for the first time in years, Ezra felt like he had something to stay alive for. The days turned into weeks. June began tending the garden out back, humming songs Ezra didn't recognize. He rebuilt the barn with her help, their hands calloused but spirits lifted. The silence between them turned soft, comfortable. Ezra found himself talking more, about his childhood, the war, the sister he'd failed. June listened, never judging. She shared her dreams of one day teaching kids to read, of having her own land. "Maybe here," she added shyly. Ezra nodded. "Maybe." In the quiet moments, their gazes lingered a little longer. 2 souls, once fractured by pain, slowly stitching together something new. Not fast, not loud, but real. One morning, June saddled a horse and rode to town alone. Ezra watched from the porch, heart thudding. Hours passed. When she returned, she brought back more than supplies. She brought word. People in town were talking about the black rancher who stood up to a gang for a woman he barely knew. Some called him a fool. Others called him a hero. June said, "You're becoming a legend." Ezra chuckled dryly. "Legends die young." June leaned closer. "Not if they have something to live for." Ezra didn't answer, but that night, he sat by the fire with her, and for the first time in decades, he played a song on his old harmonica. The seasons shifted. Rain returned to the plains, and with it, life. The once barren garden flourished. Horses grew strong. Ezra and June carved out a rhythm. Mornings of labor, afternoons of stories, and evenings wrapped in golden silence. They never spoke of marriage, but something deeper bloomed between them: respect, trust, and love born not of fantasy, but of fire. One day, Ezra looked at the old photograph of his sister and whispered, "I did it, Lil." June stood behind him, arms wrapped around his shoulders. Together, they'd built more than a home. They'd reclaimed what the West tried to take: hope. Ezra's story traveled beyond the canyon, whispered in saloons and sung in distant towns. The black rancher who gave shelter, who fought like a devil to protect what mattered, who turned pain into protection. Strangers came by to meet him. Some brought gifts, others just wanted to shake his hand. Ezra remained humble, never seeking glory. But he welcomed those who came in peace. June turned their ranch into a place of safety, for women on the run, for orphans with nowhere to go, for drifters with kind eyes. The home that once echoed only with wind now overflowed with life. Ezra never imagined this, but he embraced it with both hands. One evening, a young boy asked Ezra, "Weren't you scared?" Ezra thought for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "But being scared ain't the same as being beaten." The boy nodded, understanding more than he could say. Ezra looked out over the land he nearly died for, land that was now worth living for. June stepped beside him, and together they watched the sunset paint the sky. It wasn't a perfect life. but it was theirs. And in the ever-changing wilds of the West, that meant everything. Ezra never called himself a hero. But in every fire rebuilt, every seed planted, and every child saved, he became one. The wind told their story better than any man. Whispers of a black rancher and a runaway bride who defied the odds echoed across the plains. No books were written, no medals handed out, but the land remembered. The trees that grew tall, the barn that stood strong, the laughter in the garden, all proof that love, when forged in adversity, can outlast even the fiercest storm. Ezra and June's names faded with time, but their legacy endured. A story not of conquest, but of courage, not of revenge, but redemption. And the ranch stood as a monument to second chances. Years passed. Children grew. The ranch became a sanctuary. Ezra grew old but never weary. June's hair turned silver, but her spirit burned bright. They watched generation after generation rise stronger, braver. Ezra would often sit on the porch, harmonica in hand, playing the same tune he'd played for June that first night by the fire. Strangers still came, drawn by the tale. And each time, Ezra simply said, "We just did what was right." No grand speeches. No need. The truth was in the land, the laughter, the legacy. And in June's eyes, still shining, even after all the years. One final sunset painted the sky in brilliant gold. Ezra sat alone, his thoughts far away. June had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by those she loved. Ezra buried her beneath the willow she planted, the one that bloomed late but strong. He placed his hand on the soil and whispered, "Thank you for coming here." Alone once more, but not lonely, Ezra knew his time would come soon. And when it did, the land would welcome him, too. The wind would carry both their names across the canyon, and the fire in their story would never die. Not as long as someone remembered. If you made it this far, you felt the fire too. The story of a black rancher, a runaway bride, and the fight for something worth protecting. If this tale moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this story. Because legends live not in books or medals, but in the hearts of those who carry them forward. Every view, every like, every word you type helps keep their spirit alive. Thank you for riding with us, till the end. Until the next tale beneath the western sun, stay wild, stay true, and never forget the power of standing your ground.